Hey everybody, John Wagnon here with Dev Central. We're coming to you with another Lightboard lesson, and today we're going to talk about some OWASP Top 10 vulnerabilities. And the OWASP Top 10 just came out, the 2017 version, so the latest and greatest. And the number one vulnerability, which has been the number one vulnerability for many, many years, is injection attacks. So injection attacks can happen from database injections, LDAP. There's all kinds of different injection attacks, but the basics around the injection attack is relatively similar across all the different types of injection attacks. So I'm going to kind of draw a couple of, or a quick scenario here, talk about how these things happen and maybe some ways to guard against these. All right, so let's say you have a user out here in the internet, and that user wants to access your web application. So you have a web application out here, and this web application has, a page. You go to www.webapp.com, and it's got a page, and maybe it's got like a username field right here, and like a password field right here. And let's say that part of the design of this web application is certainly a lot of the HTML and CSS and JavaScript and all that all the different components that go into this. But there's also a database back here. So I'm going to put DB that contains all kinds of stuff, and maybe there's a whole bunch of different databases. But let's say, for example, there's one that has all of the usernames and all the passwords, and it's stored here in this database. All right. Then what happens is when a user accesses the web application, here's the username right here, and here's the password field. So they're going to type in their username and type in their password. And then this page is going to send a request down to the database, and it's going to say, hey, I've got this input to get the username and password. Is that one of our accessible usernames and passwords? Well, when it does that, it uses a certain type of language to communicate with the database. And there's a very, very common one. Most of you probably know what we're talking about here, but if you don't know, there's this language called Structured Query Language, SQL. And so a lot of these injection attacks focus on SQL injections, is the way you kind of pronounce that. Well, see, what SQL is that's the language used to talk to this database. And there may be, the structure of this may have something that says something like, select, star from, users with, username this, and then, return whatever. So, but if you say something like select star, then that means select everything from, say, this username password database. Well, typically, you don't want to return that unless that is a valid request. And so what these malicious users will do is they'll say, hey, I'm going to inject maybe some kind of malicious code in here to trick this backend database to return all of this data. So then that way, I, as a bad guy, can see all of your, in this case, usernames and passwords. And so, anyway, and then even beyond that, sometimes you can type in these SQL commands so that it actually even tricks the system into running like system commands. So there's a lot of different things that could happen from these injection attacks. You could have a leakage of usernames and passwords, credit card numbers, other kind of sensitive data. You could run system commands off of these things. So the bottom line is, whenever a user inputs, say, a username and password, and it could be more than just username and password fields in a web app, but I'm using that as an example here. Whenever they input data into that, and then that ultimately kicks off a SQL request to a backend database, you want to make sure that all that is good to go from an authorized, valid user. So the question is, how do we guard against this kind of stuff? And the short answer is, make sure that you build your web application properly with proper access controls and proper defense mechanisms in place to allow this to not go on. Because frankly, anytime there is a user input, that needs to be assumed to be untrusted data. So you need to make sure that that is valid before you run any kind of back-end database commands. All right, so a couple of things that you could do to guard against this is a concept called query parameterization. I'm not going to write it up here because that's big words. Query parameterization, and basically what that means is that the commands that are sent from say this front end, web app page to a back end database, there are parameters that are involved in that, and then there's the very basic SQL command itself. And so what you want to do is you want to separate the SQL statements from any kind of parameters that would be included in a callback to the database. So query parameterization is a huge one. Kind of above that, I would say that you need to validate any kind of user input. So for example, if this is a username and you know that based on your web application, you only allow characters that are not numbers, not special symbols, that kind of stuff, then you need to make sure that whatever is put in here, conforms to the to the requirements that you have for that specific field. The same thing with the password. So anyway, so you need to make sure that those are in place as well. There are other kind of controls, if you will, that you can put in place from a SQL perspective. I'll put limit on here, L-I-M-I-T. So you can use some limiting different commands or different features in these databases and database calls that if you were to be exposed and if someone did get your entire username and password list, then you can put some limits in place so that, hey, when data is sent back from a database call, then it only limits it to a certain amount of data that's ever sent back at any one time. So again, in the case that you are actually exposed, then you can actually limit the exposure. So anyway, this is a very, very common attack method to use an injection into a vulnerable database. Man, it happens all the time out there. So again, the number one answer is build your web application properly using the proper controls. And then and there are some other answers like web application firewalls that you can put in place and some other things that you can do. But at its heart, build this thing correctly so that any kind of malicious or nefarious type of access is not going to be able to get to it in the first place. So injection attacks, huge thing. They've been the number one vulnerability on the OWASP top 10 for many, many years. It's still a big deal. It's still, it's still out there, still used all the time. So be careful out there, build your web app properly, and let's be safe on the internet today. So thanks for watching this Lightboard lesson video, and we'll see you guys out there in the community.